COVID pandemic triggered the largest global economic crisis in more than a century. Most governments enacted swift and encompassing policy responses that alleviated the worst immediate economic impacts of the crisis. The World Development Report 2022, Finance for an Equitable Recovery, examines the central role of finance in the economic recovery from the pandemic. This manifests economic impact of COVID in historical perspective. Economic activity contracted in 2020 in about 90% of countries, exceeding the number of countries seeing such declines during two world wars, the Great Depression of the 1930s, the emerging economic debt crisis of the 1980s, and 2007 to 2009 global financial crisis. This demonstrates policy response to the pandemic. Magnitude of the fiscal response as a share of GDP was almost uniformly large by any historic metric in high-income countries and uniformly small or non-existent in low-income countries. Figure highlights that the immediate response to the pandemic included the number of policy tools that were either untested in emerging economies or altogether unprecedented at this scale. One example is the extensive debt repayment moratoria and freezes on credit reporting that were enacted in many countries around the world. This displays capacity of banking systems to absorb increases in NPLs by country income group. Sharply rising NPLs can give rise to a negative feedback loop between deteriorating financial sector performance and weakening real economic activity, which can also exacerbate economic inequality. This illustrates share of enterprises in arrears or expecting to fall into arrears within 6 months in selected countries. More than 70% share of enterprises are being recorded from South Africa, Nepal, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, Kenya, Mongolia, Gabon, Sri Lanka, and Senegal. This reveals that quarterly trends in credit conditions by country income group during 2018 to 21. Review of quarterly central bank surveys on credit conditions in both advanced and emerging economies find that the majority of economies for which surveys were available experienced several quarters of tightening credit standards after the onset of the crisis. This indicates general government gross debt by country income group for 2010 to 20. Average total debt burdens among low and middle income countries increased by roughly 9% of GDP during the last year of the pandemic. This illustrates sovereign debt restructuring and time spent in default. Selected countries during 1975 to 2000. Figure reveals that resolution of sovereign debt distress is often delayed for years, even when a country enters negotiations with its creditors. Multiple rounds of debt restructuring are often needed for it to emerge from distress. Economic and social disruptions exposed in exacerbated existing economic fragilities, especially in emerging economies where poverty rates soared and inequality worsened. Although this report concentrates on the key domestic financial and economic risks produced by the pandemic, the country's recovery prospects will also be shaped by events in the global economy. One example is fluctuations in the price of primary commodities, which is an important source of revenue for many emerging economies. Another example is exchange rate and interest rate risks, which could emerge as economic activity in advanced economies recovery and stimulus programs are withdrawn, resulting in central banks tightening global liquidity and raising interest rates. These global developments expose households, firms, and governments in emerging economies to financial risks. Carefully chosen policy mix must therefore take into account both domestic and global threats to an equitable recovery. Reference for today's presentation is from World Bank's flagship report named as World Development Report 2022. Thanks for watching.